I was awoken by the gentle swaying of the ship, and quickly got dressed to enjoy another day aboard this luxurious cruise ship. I walked outside my cabin to the deck and gazed out at the beautiful clear ocean on all sides. My eyes were drawn to something on the horizon directly ahead of us. It was only as we got closer that I discovered it was someone floating on top of a piece of luggage. He was dressed completely in black, and I could see his skin was peeling off from exposure to the elements. One of the crew also spotted him, and they quickly began to organize to bring him aboard. They were just about to lift him aboard when I had a premonition that he would bring nothing but death and destruction to all of us. I shouted out at them to stop, but they ignored me. The other passengers shot me looks of disgust as they didn't understand why I had shouted out my warning. I was standing there trying to decide what I should do when a woman beside me began screaming at the top of her lungs and pointing behind me. I followed her finger and felt my heart sink as I saw a giant wave bearing down on us. It was a couple 100 feet high and covered every inch of the horizon. There was a stampede as everyone fled inside in hopes of finding shelter. I had just reached the dining room when the wave struck the ship. I was knocked off my feet and flung into a nearby wall as the entire ship shuddered from the collision. The ship began to tilt, and I feared that we would be turned upside down. I could hear the pandemonium in all directions as the ship was thrown around the place. A chandelier smashed to the ground inches away from me, and my hands were shaking as I stared at pieces of glass embedded into the floor directly between my fingers. After what seemed like an eternity, the shaking ceased, and I finally mustered the courage to push myself to my feet. The dining room was littered with bodies, as some people hadn't been as fortunate as myself. One man had been crushed against the wall by a piano, and his mouth was now filled with the piano keys. It would have looked almost hysterical if it wasn't so morbid. I made my way outside in hopes of finding more survivors. I walked past dozens of dead crew members whose body had been torn apart by some unknown force. Their spines had been torn out and now lay on top of their bodies like trophies. I found a large group of people congregating around the pool and went over to find out what was happening. An elderly nun stood at the front telling people that this was their punishment for all their sins. I snorted under my breath, but went silent as I saw the annoyed looks from some of the others. I listened in terror as the woman proclaimed that the only way to survive was to kill all the unbelievers. Many of the people around me began nodding in agreement with her. I quickly fled back to my cabin in case any of them decided to turn on me. I hid there for the next few hours before hunger forced me out in search for food. The ship seemed almost deathly silent, compared to the previous day where it had been bristling with activity. I passed numerous rooms with corpses hanging within as the occupants had decided to take their own lives. I reached the deck before freezing in place as I heard a commotion nearby. I moved as silently as I could in that direction. I turned a corner to discover the religious zealots now gathered around two oars that had been fastened together to make a cross. They were praying in unison, while two of them held a girl no older than 5 between them. The little girl looked around in fear, but she got no help from those around her. I watched on in fascination as they led the girl up to the makeshift cross and lifted her up onto it. I was barely able to suppress a scream as they began using nails to attach her to the cross. The poor thing was convulsing as the nails impaled her flesh. I turned to flee and almost tripped over the nun who had been standing behind me. I could see the madness in her eyes as she gave my outfit a disapproving look. I flinched away as she rubbed blood on my forehead and began chanting, "Unworthy." I risked a peek over my shoulder to see the others marching towards me. I pushed the nun out of my way and ran as fast as I could with the sounds of the others close behind me. I managed to lose them and hurried back to my cabin. I was forced to drink the water from the toilet as I had no other option. I was once again forced to leave my cabin as my growling stomach was demanding food. I crept along until I reached the dining room and peered inside before quickly ducking my head back. I waited until my head stopped pounding before once again peering inside. The nun stood on the same piano that had crushed the man a few days ago. His body lay forgotten as she raised her hands to the heavens. A small, wiry man was dragged forward and dropped at her feet. He lay there sobbing and pleading for mercy. She raised his head up and spat in his face before slitting open his throat. She seemed to take great pleasure as the gush of blood sprayed forward and saturated her clothing. One by one, her congregation walked up and she marked a cross on their foreheads using the blood that was pooling at her feet. I moved away from that gruesome scene and wandered about until I found a kitchen. I filled a bag full of enough food and water to last me a few days. I opened up the freezer to see what lay inside, and almost vomited at what lay inside. The crew's frozen bodies were hanging from hooks, and it looked like someone had been hacking off pieces of flesh. I ran out the door and vomited over the edge. The squawking of seagulls made me raise my head, and I felt my blood run cold as I looked down the deck. Almost 24 crosses lined the deck, and nailed to each one was a child. Seagulls were perched on their bodies, and I watched in disgust as one of them plucked out an eyeball and devoured it. The children raised their heads at the same time, and I gazed into their eyeless faces as they chanted repeatedly in unison, "Unworthy, unworthy." Their cries filled my ears as I rushed back to my cabin and hid beneath my bed. The next morning I was shaken awake by the nun who stood over my bed with a sinister smile on her face. I was then forcibly dragged out of my bed by 2 of her converts towards the dining room. I let out an audible gasp as the door opened, as the floor was littered with bodies whose throat had been sliced open. Standing front and center in the room was the man that had been rescued the day that everything fell apart. His face was plain, but I could tell that he was much older than he looked. He ushered me forward, and my legs moved on their own accord until I sunk to my knees in front of me. He lifted my head and tilted it from side to side as if examining me. He indicated for me to stand up and to look behind me as I was unable to refuse. My eyes widened in terror as the 2 converts who dragged me here began slicing open their own throats. I couldn't understand how they weren't killing over dead, as their heads were practically hanging off by the time they were finished. They turned to face the man in black behind me and nodded to them. He clapped his hands, which sounded thunderous, as the 2 men sank dead to the floor. I watched in fascination as he walked forward and placed a coin over each of their eyes. I gazed around the room. I saw every other person had coins on their eyes. Movement out of the corner of my eye drew my attention back to the man in black, who stood directly in front of the nun. She stood there, clutching her rosary beads and shooting me smirks. He lifted her head and spun it around 180 degrees until she was looking directly behind me. She had an almost confused look on her face as she blinked a couple times before sinking dead to the ground. The man in black snapped his fingers at me before pointing at the door. I took the hint and rushed out of the door as fast as my feet could take me. I found the nearest lifeboat, and after numerous attempts, managed to get it into the water. I watched on silently as the ship began to sink beneath the waves. I could see the children on the crosses waving to me as they disappeared from view. I was adrift at sea for a few days before another cruise ship spotted me and helped me aboard. I have been shocked to tell them the tale about what happened, but I can tell everyone is curious. I now stand on the edge of the deck and watch in dread as the crew help aboard a man adorned in black, and fear that this nightmare is about to start again.